All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Liberty Me Live. We're here tonight with our monthly Future of Freedom Foundation webinar with Sheldon Richman. This week, we'll be talking about the decline of political satire in America and Jon Stewart in particular. Sheldon Richman, if you don't know, is the vice president of the Future of Freedom Foundation and the editor of their monthly journal, Future of Freedom. For 15 years, he was the editor of The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. And he's the author of several books, including Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, and Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. He's been widely published everywhere. He's an expert on just about everything, and he's a wonderful teacher. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to him, Sheldon Richman.
I try to be an expert on knowing what I don't know. But thank you for that introduction. Uh, as I usually like to say, being the argumentative person that I am, I think I should take time to rebut the introduction, but since time is scarce, I won't. Well, this is a fun topic, I think. Sad, but at the same time fun. So I hope it'll lead to some a good discussion. Uh, Everybody probably by now is aware of the flap involving Jon Stewart on Election Day. Uh, so I want to talk about that, and I want to draw some other stories into it that have been going on lately. In particular, the Jonathan Gruber story, which I'm sure everybody now knows about, and I'll talk about that a little bit and remind everybody what happened there. It involves the passage of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. But a little background. Let's talk a little bit of background before we get into America's civic religion and Jon Stewart. I want to say a little bit about political satire. Uh, as I think most people know, it has a long and honorable history. Uh, we can name a lot of names. I'm sure I'll leave some important people out. Since my article was published a couple of weeks ago, I've gone back and actually added names because I felt like I slighted people. But obviously, it would be an endless list. But it includes, I mean, you can go back to the Greeks, Aristophanes, and then I jumped to Shakespeare and Jonathan Swift and W.S. Gilbert, Mark Twain, George Orwell, Lenny Bruce, Dick Gregory, Tom Lehrer, uh, who, along with David Frost, was responsible for a great series in the 1960s called "That Was the Week That Was." Most of you are probably too young to remember that. George Carlin, of course. There was a British series called Spit and Image in the 80s that ran on American television that involved caricature puppets of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the other political principles of the day. Very good biting satire. Another British series called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. You can find those online, uh, and I advise you to take a look at them. They're hilarious, really well done, making fun of the British government. I would add the Smothers Brothers, the early Saturday Night Live, Dave Barry, my old friend Dave Barry, The Onion, South Park, Family Guy on some episodes, and so many more. So there's a great tradition of political satire, poking fun, but in a deep way, at the political system in order to ridicule it. Unfortunately, while it would be a slight exaggeration to say that political satire is dead in America, I believe it's been on the critical list for some time, and that's too bad because we really could use it now. Now, throughout history, satirists have risked their liberty and even their lives to use humor to engage in deep commentary about the reigning political system and its exalted political figures, the people who called themselves leaders, but I think are surely better described as rulers and misleaders. But no satirist risks his life or liberty in America today. It's a perfectly safe environment for making fun of the government. I mean, they've droned some American citizens in outside of the country, and they've arrested people, but so far no haven't arrested anybody for satire that I can recall recently. It was worse in some respects some years ago. Lenny Bruce was harassed by the police. Uh, the excuse they used was his drug use, but I think also he was such a good satirist, making so slashing fun of the political system that I have a feeling that was one of the reasons the police harassed him constantly. Uh, So this lack of risk is one of the things that makes it so puzzling. That good scarcity, good satire is so scarce. You know, is it fear that keeps satire in a safely confined, or is it simply that so few people today can see the fundamental flaws in the American political system, which trashes liberty in so many ways? So let's talk about Jon Stewart and the host of the Daily Show. Now he's probably regarded as America's premier political satirist, which I think is kind of ironic given what the story. Uh, Given the fact that he felt it was necessary to recant after apparently uttering a heresy according to America's civil religion, namely democracy. In an election day interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, uh, after being asked whether he had voted that day, he said no, to which Amanpour reacted with probably feigned amazement. No, she said no. And he continued, I just moved. I don't even know where my thing is now. So that was discussed on CNN as if it was some kind of scandal. And that night on his own show, Stewart felt that he had to reassure the audience about this. So first he cracked the joke about assuring them that he's actually known where his thing is since age 13. So he had to, make a bit of a risque crack there. But then he acknowledged that his answer to Amanpour earlier in the day had created, quote, a bit of a story. So he's right. It was a bit of a storm, actually. So he went on to say, quote, to set the record straight, I did vote today. I was being flip and it kind of took off. I shouldn't have been flip about that. It sent a message that I didn't think voting was important or that I didn't think it was a big issue. And I do. And I did vote. I was being flip and I shouldn't have done that. That was stupid. So I apologize. Now, where to begin in dealing with this? First off, how did this flip answer, assuming it was flip in the first place, create a bit of a story? I mean, he's a comedian after all. Several nights a week, he makes fun of politicians, I would say at a fairly superficial level, and government bungling. He does flip for a living. So who got upset with his reply, aside from perhaps Amanpour? Whether one believes Stewart's answer or not, how in the world was it the stuff of public controversy? I mean, this is really baffling when you think about it. Does no one have a sense of humor in the United States? Must he say just kidding after every sentence? Should his producers put at the bottom of the screen J/K every time he says something, just so no one will make a mistake and will realize that he's joking about everything? Maybe one reason political satire is so scarce is that Americans don't get it. They just don't understand it. Paul Fussell, who wrote excellent books on how war degrades culture, said that World War II killed Americans' sense of irony. Just thought that disappeared from the culture. Uh, he writes about this in his book Wartime, which is a very good book, and I recommend it if you're interested in the impact of war, World War One and Two in particular, on American culture. Check out Fussell's books on on those subjects. So Stewart furnishes some excellent evidence of Fussell's claim that Americans just don't understand satire or irony. But even allowing for the irony impairment of American culture, did Stewart really feel he had to apologize? Did he think he'd lose his audience if he became known as one who was flip about the holy right of voting? I realize that ratings are a matter of life and death, but come on. I doubt that his career was in jeopardy. He might have even picked up a few voters. By the way, I don't really think it was even a flip remark. All he said was, I don't know where the polls are in my new neighborhood." That's hardly flip. It's it, it might it's actually a reason someone might have for not voting if they're moving. So it doesn't constitute a flip remark at all. uh, but so that's one interpretation that he was afraid of the ramifications of being known as somebody who took voting casually. But there's another view, which was actually voiced by my son, Ben Richman, who, by the way, has a keen eye for politics, but also is a very good rock guitarist. I'll put in a plug for his band, the Revolutioners. But he wrote on Facebook, I don't think he was giving into public pressure either. I think he genuinely felt that joking about it, namely voting, was wrong. At the end of the day, Stewart loves the system, he says. So I think that's right. Uh, After all, Stewart favors mandatory national service. In an interview recently, he said, quote, there should be a draft where every young person has to do 1 year of something, military, public works, something, so that we all feel invested in the same game, because that's the part that we've lost. Well, if we all want to be invested in the same game, why didn't he include comedians in this draft of any age? I mean, after all, if we're all going to be invested in the same game. I don't understand the arbitrary age limit that he wants to put on this for young people. It seems a little bit hypocritical to me. I will concede that Stewart can be funny at times when he pokes fun at politicians for their gaffes and indiscretions, although I do think it's at a fairly superficial level. Uh, and I like a distinction that my colleague at the Center for a Stateless Society, Ryan Calhoun, pointed out, and I recommend the article he did about Jon Stewart at c4ss.org, where he contrasted a true comedian with what he calls a fool, or name another word for a court jester, and he discusses what the role of a court jester was in previous eras. This was someone who could come to the court before the king and the queen and make fun of them and of the regime, and they would laugh. The courtiers would all laugh, and as long as he didn't venture over some line, which could be invisible or very fine, he was perfectly safe. It was considered okay. People could let off steam and laugh a little bit, but he was always in danger of, if he stepped over the line, if he said something that he shouldn't say, he could be in big trouble. And Calhoun's point is that while Stewart's hero, or claimed hero, George Carlin, was a comedian or a satirist in the best tradition of that word, Stewart, in fact, is a court jester or a fool. He's the guy standing there wearing the funny hat with the bells on it, holding the little thing with the bells on it, shaking it after making a funny line that everyone's supposed to laugh at. But he backs away. Uh, Occasionally he's ventured into a minefield. He's actually surprised me once or twice in talking about the Middle East and Israel. But if you watch closely, you'll see that he doesn't plunge the dagger in too deep. He is a man of the system, a progressive. He believes government is good. The more active, the better. He rarely gets down to fundamentals, and on the rare occasion when he does, he quickly retreats. He's hardly the type who would unmask America's civic religion, democracy, and really make fun of it, because you can see how he acted when he just made that fairly harmless remark. This religion is sacred, and apparently he has no problem with that. He doesn't seem to understand that democracy rests on some flawed premises, two of which are every vote counts. I mean, you just can't go on TV and say, no one vote counts. When they tell you your vote counts, to make sure you get out and vote, that's a lot of nonsense. You're not going to see anybody say that on television. Certainly not anybody who's got a regular show, and we wouldn't expect it from Jon Stewart. And the second premise is that the educated voter is some sort of practicable ideal. In other words, that there can be truly an educated voter. Of course, in a system like the U.S. system, where government has its hands in everything, it's impossible to be an educated voter. You have to be an expert in economics and a whole lot of other subjects. You'd have to know a lot of history to be able to judge what candidates promise to do, because how can you otherwise judge such a thing? And of course, given the fact that your own vote doesn't count in any sizable jurisdiction, why would you invest any time to gain the knowledge and understanding that's required to judge the pronouncements of the politicians? So there's bad incentives, and there's this impossible objective of being a truly educated voter you know, who's reading the federal budget, understands the federal budget, and its government is so opaque and so complex and so involved in so many things that it would just be impossible to be someone who was up on every issue and could judge candidates. You'd also have to study political philosophy and on and on and on. On this point about one vote not counting, this is just simple arithmetic. I know some people get offended by this. I presume this crowd here won't, but I've talked about this many times before, and people will get outright mad at you if you suggest that their vote doesn't count. But it's just math. Okay, it's one, any sizable jurisdiction, your vote is like a drop in the ocean, and it's not going to make a difference. In fact, Gordon Tullock, great economist, great person, great theorist who had a great theory of government failure, one of the founders of the public choice school, unfortunately, who just died a couple of weeks ago. He said you have a better chance of being killed on the way to the polls than of affecting the outcome of an election. So at this point, let me bring in the Jonathan Gruber story because it dovetails so well. Jonathan Gruber is a MIT professor, is considered an expert in health policy, helped to devise Mitt Romney's healthcare plan in Massachusetts when Romney was governor, and then was a very significant consultant and highly paid. Apparently got something like $6 million over the years. He's gotten $6 million from different government agencies being a consultant and writing reports. He was involved in the architecture of the Affordable Care Act. Very important person. Recently caught on video saying that Obamacare passed because of the stupidity of the American voter and the lack of transparency about how it would be funded. And of course, this is the classic definition of a gaffe, right? It's when you say something that is either true or something you really believe, but it's impolitic to say it publicly. That's the definition of a gaffe. And so that's what happened here. Here's one of the elite saying we only passed this thing because American voters are stupid, and the process is not is so untransparent that nobody outside could have figured out what was going on. Of course, the Obama and Nancy Pelosi and all the people who were involved in getting this bill passed are running around now with their hair on fire. The first tactic was to say we don't even know who this guy Gruber is, and that fell away because there's ample evidence that Gruber was a close confidant of Obama. Obama cited him. Nancy Pelosi cited him. Everybody knew who he was, but they acted like they never heard of the guy. They said, "I don't even know the guy." So that fell apart. And then they just called him stupid for saying that the American voter is stupid. The issue actually is not stupidity. I mean, Gruber should have picked another word if he was going to really be honest. It's not a matter of stupidity. It's a matter of lack of incentives to become educated, and the fact that the government is very, very good at creating opaqueness, so that you can't penetrate the veil and see what is exactly going on. There's a great book on this subject by Charlotte Twite that I'd like to recommend called Dependent on DC. And she has a marvelous theory of how government raises the political transaction costs so that it's very difficult for the average person who's busy making a living and raising a family to, number one, figure out what the government is doing, and number two, reacting to it in some effective way if the person happens to figure out what the government's doing. So you get these two barriers, two barriers to understanding and change. And that's why she calls those political transaction costs. Number one, the government can make sure you don't know what's going on. And like I said, try reading the federal budget sometime, or any bill. Don't forget, Obamacare was 2,200 pages, and even that understates how opaque it was, because so many of those pages were not what the Obamacare was going to mean, but was directions to the Department of Health and Human Services or other agencies to write rules about particular things. So in other words, the rules themselves were not passed by members of Congress. It was just authorization for executive agencies to write the rules. So if you read the bill, if you read the 2,200 pages in their entirety and paid good attention and really absorbed it, you still wouldn't know what the bill was going to mean once it was passed, which is why Nancy Pelosi said back during the days it was being debated, we won't know what's in it until it's passed. Now, it's really funny for her to be denouncing Gruber for saying what he said when she herself said, we won't know what's in the bill until it's passed. In other words, it is transparent, and the American people can't know. But the only thing I would correct is it's not a matter of stupidity. Anyway, I think this ties in with the Jon Stewart point, because he doesn't want to make fun of voting, but look what a joke voting and the results of voting are, and yet his very minor act of humor he had to apologize for. Let's go a little deeper in Stewart's background. It was only in 2009 when he called Harry Truman a war criminal during a conversation with a noted neoconservative. And the reason he called him a war criminal is obviously the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki toward the end of World War II in 1945. Now, that statement was actually not satirical or ironic or flip. It was just the unvarnished truth. Truman's victims threatened no one. These were civilians, Japanese civilians. The war was essentially over, yet those civilians were subjected to the most ghastly fates. Some were vaporized on the spot, literally leaving only their shadows behind. I'm not exaggerating here. And don't forget that Truman dropped the second bomb 3 days later, so one bomb wasn't enough. And he considered dropping a third, but he decided at that point that he didn't want to kill any more children. So reading about what the victims experienced are sure to turn your stomach. But nevertheless, Stewart recanted a couple of days later. On his program, he said, quote, the other night I may have mentioned during the discussion we were having that Harry Truman was a war criminal. And after saying it, I thought to myself, that was dumb. And it was dumb. Stupid, in fact. So I shouldn't have said that. I did. So I say now, no, I don't believe that to be the case. The atomic bomb, a very complicated decision in the context of a horrific war, and I walk that back because it was, in my estimation, a stupid thing to say. Sorry. Close quote. Stewart did not explain or bother to explain why the statement was stupid. He likes that word, apparently. He called his voting remarks stupid. Or why Truman's decision was complicated. That's what every Truman apologist says. He didn't elaborate. What was complicated? What was complicated about it? But we know what Stewart meant. In America's civic religion, it is heresy to talk about an American war as though it was a massive series of crimes committed by our leaders. You must not say that. Actually, that's not it. You must not think that. 2 and 2 is 5. Never forget it. Yes, it is permissible to say that the war in Vietnam, never World War II, however, was a blunder, a colossal mistake. But don't say it was mass murder and a humongous criminal operation. Don't say the perpetrators should be brought to justice. Noam Chomsky did that and was thenceforth barred from publications that had regularly published him, like the New York Review of Books. It is a rare mainstream publication that would let you say that Bush 43, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, Rice, Tenet, Petraeus, McChrystal, et al. Should be hauled before the International Criminal Court to stand trial for their wars of aggression against the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. Has Nuremberg been erased from the history books? I should also point out Stewart's fawning obsequiousness before court historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin and courtiers like former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, and Henry Kissinger. You can look those up. Google Jon Stewart and any one of those names and watch the videos. See how he treats these former Secretaries of State. Every time they publish a book, he brings them on and fawns over them. He had Kissinger on a couple of years ago when Kissinger had a book out, and he just greeted him by saying, "Doctor, doctor, 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 please sit down." And it was disgusting. Actually, it was rather sickening. So getting back to, by the way, regarding fawning about Henry Kissinger, Hillary Clinton, who is a presumptive presidential aspirant, is reviewed over the last weekend, reviewed in the Washington Post, Henry Kissinger's latest book called World Order. I recommend it to you to see what Hillary thinks of Henry Kissinger. It's going to be the subject of my op-ed tomorrow, so you might want to watch for that at fff.org. Getting back to Stewart and voting, his remark was actually pretty lame. I think I've said some of this before. All he said was that he couldn't vote because he didn't know where the polls were. Uh, he didn't say he was happy about that. Here's what he could have said. Did I vote? Of course I voted. Would I pass up a critical opportunity to add my one single drop of water to the vast ocean? Why, every vote counts. Had I stayed home, the whole country, heck, the whole world might be different. You must be crazy to think I'd let that happen. That would have been satire. But it also would have struck too deep at America's civic religion, which holds that trudging faithfully to the polls every few years is the be-all and end-all of freedom. That voting majorities by nature must violate the rights of voting minorities and non-voters is curiously overlooked. In fact, you better not say that. In fact, I always like to say, in democracy, the majority rules and the rights of the minority are protected. I submit that those two things can't both be true. Okay, pick which one you want, but they both can't be true. What I wouldn't give to see Americans' reaction, the looks on their faces, to Emma Goldman saying on television, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Excuse me, but I grew up watching George Carlin, supposedly Stewart's hero. So call me spoiled, but Jon Stewart is the George Carlin, what Joe Scarborough is the H.L. Mencken. Here's how Carlin handled politics. Quote, I don't vote. On election day, I stay home. I firmly believe that if you vote, you have no right to complain. Now, some people like to twist that around. They say if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. But where's the logic in that? If you vote and you elect dishonest and competent politicians, and they get into office and screw everything up, you are responsible for what they've done. You voted it. You voted them in. You caused the problem. You have no right to complain. I, on the other hand, who did not vote, who did not even leave the house on election day, am in no way responsible for what these politicians have done, and have every right to complain about the mess that you created. Now, can you imagine, and any of you who are George Carlin fans, imagine him ever apologizing for such a statement? The very thought I mean, it's unthinkable. You can't really form the thought. So I leave you on this note. George, where are you? We need you. I will stop there and throw things out for conversation and questions, and let's have a good discussion about this.
All right, if you have questions, you can ask them in the little Q&A box in the upper right. Um, I, in thinking about, Jon Stewart in particular coming up to this event, Jon Stewart, I enjoy his comedy. I watch occasionally, not that I have a whole lot of time for TV, but anytime it gets to a serious issue where he has a chance to actually bite at the administration, I've always been disappointed. And it's hard, like, I don't want to say I don't like Jon Stewart, because I still do like Jon Stewart, but he's stuck in this he's stuck in a system and in a mindset that so many people are stuck in. Do you have any thoughts on how we can break people out of that mindset?
Uh, Not particular. I don't know what would happen if one of us had a one-to-one conversation with Jon Stewart. I mean, I think Jon Stewart is probably a Democrat, probably considers himself a good liberal or progressive. So he's wedded to the system. I don't know if he's ever encountered radical analysis uh, of any kind. I assume as a younger man in college, perhaps he did, and maybe flirted with what we think of as left-wing radicalism, not libertarianism. I don't know what he thinks of libertarianism. I guess he's had Ron Paul on, uh, but I'm not sure what. Those interviews, he's often just going for laughs, and you can't really tell. But I assume he thinks, activist government is compassionate, humane, and anybody who doesn't favor that is callous and doesn't care about the poor and the sick. Uh, and so I think a lot of libertarian thinking would be foreign to him. I don't think he would understand it. There's someone named Jon Stewart here on the attendance list, so maybe he can speak for himself. Maybe he's in the crowd. I'm flattered if he's attending.
I have a feeling that we have an imposter among us. I talked to Judge Napolitano after his second appearance on The Daily Show, and he
Ah,
said he really thinks that Jon Stewart is a fellow traveler, but he seems to even more just recently be going down a slightly different road. So who knows?
well, apart from the content of his his own views, there's something very uh, paradoxical about someone who regards himself as a social comedian, and a satirist who apologizes. When I go back to what I was saying at the end, who could imagine George Carlin apologizing for anything he said? And now George Carlin thought out what he said. I don't think he spoke impulsively. I mean, I think he put a lot of care and time into what he was going to say, and he was speaking what he believed. Uh, I can't imagine any kind of outcry forcing him into saying, "Hey, I'm sorry. I really shouldn't have joked about that." Nobody can imagine George Carlin doing that. So for Stewart to first of all claim that he idolizes Carlin, and second to hold himself out as some sort of biting commentator on the political scene, and yet fawning over the people I mentioned, and then in these very significant cases, uh, backing away and apologizing just makes no sense at all. I don't get him. So I'll leave it at that.
Our first question is from Joseph. He asks, I would like to ask, what happened to Bill Maher? I remember hearing he was a libertarian at one point.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a Bill Maher expert. He annoys the hell out of me. I know he did used to call himself a libertarian. I think there were times when people thought libertarianism was a sexy word. Bill Buckley at times called himself a libertarian. One of his later books uh, uh, had that as a subtitle, and I wondered. I asked somebody who knew him, why would he do that? Why would he use the word libertarian? And the answer was because it sounds sexy. Uh, so that's the only thing I can explain. I can't recall ever hearing uh, Bill Maher say anything of a libertarian nature. Now, like I said, I don't know the whole of his work, or maybe somebody can point something out. And I guess I guess somewhere along the lines he said something consistent with libertarianism. But the little I know of him, and I see clips of his now and then, I don't. There's another one I don't get. What kind of satirist is he? He just sounds to me like he's an Obama guy. Uh, he sits around with what Rachel Maddow around his circle in his show and denies that the Palestinians are even occupied by the Israelis. They can't even bring themselves to say that. So that's satire. That's making fun of politicians and power. They don't speak truth to power.
We had Andrew Heaton on the other night. He's a libertarian comedian. He was talking about the difference between someone like Jon Stewart and someone like Bill Maher. Bill Maher doesn't really go for laugh lines. He goes for things that everybody in his audience already agrees with. And fundamentally, he's pretty much a Democrat who likes to smoke pot. And if he wants to call that libertarian, then fine. But the purpose of words is communication. If you're using words so far removed from what they mean to many people, then you're not really communicating well. And I mean, you do have the instances like with his statements on Palestine that just make it abundantly clear. Although, on the other hand, he did, when he had Rand Paul on the other night, apparently he was somewhat nice to Rand Paul. We can maybe debate about whether that is at all libertarian anyway, but, you know. Our next question is from Lucky Pirate. Uh, I think we're talking about Jon Stewart here, had Peter Schiff on the air, he cut and spliced the sound bites to make Schiff look like a moron in his stance on the minimum wage. Do you see how he's conducting himself similar to the administration's sterilized news media? Is this becoming normative media culture in all media?
I don't know that I can answer the second part. I mean, my hunch is that it is that it is that's the way the media is going. Uh, yes, I'm aware that he cuts and pastes interviews, which I and of course, look, he does want to get laughs, and he wants to play to his audience, the studio audience and his TV audience. So I think it's silly to go on the show. I mean, after I wrote my piece, somebody said, "Oh, what if you get invited on the show?" And I didn't think there was any chance of that. But number two, let's say that happened, I don't think it would be a good place, a good forum, because he's in control, he's going for laughs, and he's in the editing room, not the guest, not me, certainly, afterwards. And so I don't think there'd be any point to it. Some people would say, "Oh no, any publicity is good publicity," but I'm not convinced of that. So I think that's a dishonorable thing to do. If you're going to have somebody like Schiff on or anybody on to cut and paste them so that you have the advantage later when the person can't say anything, do anything about it. Uh, I mean, I just think that's not cricket, and it certainly doesn't make for good social satire. That's not what satire is about, making a fool of someone in the cutting room.
Our next question is from Ombre. Uh, Hello, Mr. Richman. Would you say that Jon Stewart is a comedian locked in the grip of an ideology?
Well, I don't know him, so it's hard to say. I've never had any kind of conversation with him, much less one about politics. But he seems to hold, the sort of the standard what we think of as liberal demo. I don't like to use the word liberal in this context, but it's the lingo now. I mean, it's been that way. Liberal democratic paradigm. Uh, I assume he's in that. I don't hear him say anything outside of that, and so that's what he's out uh, teach people through his humor and his making fun. I mean, he's not a fundamental opponent of power, and I'm not saying he needs to be an anarchist or a free market anarchist to be good and cutting. He doesn't need to go that deep, but he doesn't grasp that power itself is a problem. He likes power if it's being used by the people he likes for the purposes he likes. I mean, that's what I think comes across.
Our next question comes from Darren. Do you agree that non voting only makes sense if one rejects politics and advocates replacing voting and taxation with putting government services on the market?
Well, non-voting makes sense for other reasons too. Tulloch provides the number one reason. I mean, why you're wasting your time for the most part. Look, if you live in a town of 10 people or 25 people or 50 people, the chances of a tie are much greater than in a much larger jurisdiction. And if although usually the candidates don't make any difference, so why even there you can make an argument that why waste your time. But in any significant jurisdiction, and I think the average congressional district is 300,000 people, and so they're not all voters, of course, but if half of them are voters, some of them are underage. You're still talking about the chance of a tie is minuscule, and therefore your staying home is not going to make any difference. I mean, I hadn't voted between 1980 and the current year, and I guarantee there's not a single election that would have been different had I gone out to the polls rather than just stayed home and slept or whatever it is I was doing, working probably. uh, Nothing would have changed. So that's a reason not to vote. And there are lots of, there are many more things you could be doing that would be decisive in the time you would be voting, which is not going to be decisive. Praxeology tells us, Austrian economics tells us that people act to achieve ends. So they don't usually engage in vain activities, right? If you don't flap your arms to go to the moon, it's not worth the effort because you're not going to go. So you might as well spend your time and effort and money doing something that's decisive, where you're going to have a great chance of getting your objective. So going to the polls is not one of them. So you're in a way you're wasting your time. I'm not saying you may come up with other reasons to vote that don't involve your objective of changing the outcome. You might want to vote for the same reason you cheer or applaud at a baseball game. Okay, you're not going to change the outcome of the game by clapping, right? Let's say you're at a major league park with 30,000 people or whatever the number is. But you'll do it anyway. Feels good. You're rooting a team, so you might like a candidate. Apart from libertarianism, you might like a candidate. Maybe it's Ron Paul, and you just say, I just want to vote for him. I want to be able to tell myself or tell my friends, I voted for Ron Paul, or whoever it may be. I'm not saying that's a bad reason to vote. The only really bad reason to vote is that if you think you're going to change the outcome, which you're not going to do. We could get into the whole area of consent, and Spooner famously said, among libertarians, famously at least, said that you can't assume consent from the fact that people vote. He was arguing against that the government is by consent, and some people will say, well, I say if you vote, that's consent. And he said, no, it's not. Some people may be voting out of self-defense. It's the only thing left to them, right? One candidate in their eyes is clearly a whole lot worse than the other, so they vote against that one candidate. And he says you can't derive consent from that. So he was just explaining why people might vote and giving an explanation that doesn't involve consent. Anyway, I'm going on too long, so let's go to the next question.
Our next question is from Ombre J. He says, you mentioned something called political transaction costs. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, a great book. Didn't get the attention it should have gotten it. Charlotte White I think she wasn't a formal student of Bob Higgs, but Bob Higgs was on our dissertation committee some years ago. And she wrote a book called Depend on DC, which is a very good companion volume to Crisis on Leviathan. Probably no coincidence there. So it's a great box set to give to people for Christmas or some occasion. So she talked, what the idea of transaction costs in economics is. Transaction costs are those costs associated with, engaging in a transaction. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, if I'm going to plant rose bushes in my yard and I'm going to do it myself, then with respect to the planting, there's no transaction cost, right? I'm just going to do it myself. But if I'm going to hire a landscaper to do it, now there are transaction costs. I have to go out and go on Angie's List or find a landscaper. I may have to engage in some effort to see whether this is a good person, good reputation. Does he do the job? Is the price he charges competitive? Once I give him the contract, I need to oversee him. I want to make sure he's doing a good job before I pay him. So that effort, which I don't have if I plan it myself, you see, are all associated with the transaction between me and the landscaper. So those in economics are transaction costs. And sometimes transaction costs can be prohibitive. They can be so high that it's just not worth it, given my values and my preferences and what this particular objective is. Well, in politics, there are transaction costs as well. It would be the costs involved in getting government to do what you think is right. I'm not speaking as a libertarian here, and neither is she. She's looking at it sort of conventionally now from within the system, within a democratic system. So that would involve, say, the citizen wanting to make sure government does only what this person thinks it should do, and nothing else. And then picking candidates that will carry that out. So that means like studying up on the candidates and then monitoring the office holders once they've done it, once they're in office, to make sure they're doing what they said they were going to do. All the same, you see the parallel with the landscaper. So there are already inherent transaction costs in that political transaction. You can't do away with them if you have government. But she points out that government can raise the transaction costs. They can make them even higher and create new ones by making the system very, very opaque, right? Taking all the transparency out of it so that people can't see what's going on. And she has a catalog with great detail of so many ways that the government does this. I mean, again, read the budget, try to read a typical bill sometime. You won't even know what it does because very often a lot of the bill says amend section 2A subsection B of another law altogether. to say the following. Well, now you got to go find the first law to see what it is it's amending. A lot of bills are written that way. You can't just read it and say, okay, here's what it does. It's clear. I either like it or I don't like it. So, and then even if you could find out what government is up to, even if you broke through the veil and saw what it was up to, there are many, many transaction costs to trying to change things, right? How much money does it take to get on the ballot? Let's say you want to run a candidate, a third party, or anything else. So that's what she means by political transaction costs. It's a very good book, important book.
I just linked to the Amazon page for that book in chat, and then I also linked to an article by Charlotte Twite in the Freeman that gives an introduction to the idea. During early voting here in North Carolina, there was a woman out in the parking lot of my condo complex handing out literature for the Democratic senatorial candidate. And she said, said to me as I was walking to my car, now make sure you go out and vote. I said, oh, sorry, I have productive things to do with my time. And she said, but voting is productive. I said, I kind of wish that it were. And then I started to get in my car, and she looked at me as if I had murdered a puppy in front of her.
Yeah.
It was
it's amazing. It's like you were saying to a Christian, you believe in Jesus? I mean, he wasn't even a historical figure, much less the Son of God. I mean, it's like saying that. I've had people get very angry at me for stuff like that. It's kind of funny in a way. But they really do react. The first thing I'll say is, what if everybody thought that way? And Tulloch's answer, of course, was, well, look, if everybody said they were going to stay home, then I'd go vote. I'd be picking the winner, assuming there was one of the candidates that was worthwhile. But it would be 1-0, and he'd win. He would win. Oh, the other thing I'll mention. In 1850, Herbert Spencer wrote, I think, his first book, Social Statics, and amazing how modern this book sounds, because he takes up this charge that Carlin referred to in the quote, where they say if you didn't vote, you can't complain, and he discusses this, and he says, look, they tell you if you didn't vote, you can't complain. They say if you did vote and the winner and you pick the winner, well, you can't complain. You got your person. And if you did vote and you lost, your person lost, well, you can't complain about that either. You went in knowing the terms. You knew there was a chance you'd lose. But also, again, to bring this full circle, if you didn't vote, you can't complain. So in other words, nobody's allowed to complain. And this is Spencer in 1850 making fun of this. So things don't change, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same.
More they stay the same. All right, I'm going to put out a last call for questions and let people know what's going on here this week at Liberty Me Live. All this week, we've been having the Cycle Conference. It's the KC Youth Conference for Liberty and Entrepreneurship. We've had Walter Block, Jeffrey Tucker. We're going to have Doug Casey and Alex Daly tomorrow. We've got Rick Rule on Thursday. It's been a great week, and it's going to continue to be a great week. We hope you can join us. It runs from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. during the day. And then also Wednesday night, we've got Cal Molinay with his show Fight the Matrix. Thursday night, we've got the continuation of Zach Slayback's series on the moral psychology of politics, which has been just fascinating. And then Friday night, we're going to have, for the second week in a row, Jeffrey Hummel talking about the Civil War. This week's is why the North should have seceded from the South. So I feel like that's going to be a really fun talk. And you can check out the last week's talk, which was on the economic impact of the Civil War, in our archives at liberty.me/live. That was another fun time. All right, we've got several questions here that have popped up. D. Frank Robinson asks, if you can't write in a vote for yourself, isn't that rigging an election?
I wondered about write-ins. Are there places where they don't allow write-ins anymore? I mean, I thought they always allowed write-ins, but I haven't kept up with the election rules.
Write-in candidates don't get counted unless they've been registered in the state. In I think it's something like 40 states. So
Okay.
unless there's been preparation, then writing someone in is just it just doesn't work.
Uh, yeah, I would think if you believe in democracy, it seems to me you ought to be able to on the election day write in anybody you want. There's an honorable American tradition of writing in Mickey Mouse. I mean, it used to happen. Uh, I will confess that I voted this year. It's the first time since 1980. I voted for Ed Clark in 1980, the Libertarian candidate for president who got uh, the. Does he still hold the record for the largest vote total? I've lost track. I think so. Maybe not. Uh, but anyway, I voted and I did vote for the Libertarian. As long as I was there, I voted for the Libertarian candidates. I really went to vote on the ballot questions. I wanted to vote against raising minimum wage. I knew that wasn't going to win, and I tried to vote so that every county in Arkansas would be a wet county. In other words, I voted for alcohol. I figured no libertarian is going to attack me for voting for alcohol. That lost too, by the way. But one of the libertarians running for land commissioner was named, and this, as far as I know, is his real name. It was never discussed in the paper. I was amazed. Elvis D. Presley, not to be confused, I guess, with Elvis A. Aaron Presley. So his middle initials there. Now, while the other libertarians got 1 or 2% of the vote, he got 5%. So his name was worth 3 or 4 points. So I was bragging on Facebook that day that I had voted for Elvis Presley, and I'm sure people thought it was equivalent to voting for Mickey Mouse, but no, those are the real Elvis Presley.
As Lucy points out in chat here, I think Gary Johnson beat Clark in numbers, but not in percentage.
Not percent.
Um, Lucy asks, how can libertarians use humor to destroy the state instead of just, ranting awkwardly and making roads jokes?
How can they? Libertarians need to develop senses of humor. uh, I think humor is a very good weapon, and we should get better at that. And I know there are some, there are people I haven't kept up with. My son Ben is constantly praising Doug Stanhope. Uh, I have not seen him. I guess I should look him up. There must be YouTube videos of him, and I should check him out. Uh, Ben's a libertarian, and I think he says that Doug's humor is libertarian, and I think that can be effective. So we need to go at the culture in all sorts of ways. I mean, look how successful Rand was in bringing so many people, at least of my generation, introducing them to libertarian ideas, even if they later moved beyond Rand and became anarchists and more, let's say, more radical. She still was the portal, and that's culture. She was writing novels that convinced more people than her nonfiction. So we need people writing novels. We need people writing screenplays and stage plays, but humor, stand-up humor, can be very effective. How to do it?
I would definitely.
I don't know.
I would definitely recommend Stanhope. He kind of oscillates between extreme anti-authoritarian humor and extremely gross humor, so that turns off some people.
Yeah.
But he is very, very funny, and definitely has a strong libertarian streak. Well, I think that wraps it up for our questions. Thanks so much, Sheldon, and thanks everyone for coming. We'll be here next month on the third Tuesday of the month for the Future Freedom Foundation webinar. Thanks everyone for coming, and take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sheldon.
He's actually known where his thing is since age 13, so he had to, make a bit of a risque crack there. But then he acknowledged that his answer to Alan Poor earlier in the day had created, quote, a bit of a story. So he's right. It was a bit of a storm, actually. So he went on to say, to quote, to set the record straight, I did vote today. I was being flip and it kind of took off. I shouldn't have been flip about that. It sent a message that I didn't think voting was important or that I didn't think it was a big issue. And I do. And I did vote. I was being flip and I shouldn't have done that. That was stupid. So I apologize. Now, where to begin in dealing with this? First off, how did this flip answer, assuming it was flip in the first place, create a bit of a story? I mean, he's a comedian after all. Several nights a week, he makes fun of politicians, I would say at a fairly superficial level, and government bungling. He does flip for a living. So who got upset with his reply, aside from perhaps Amanpour? Whether one believes Stewart's answer or not, how in the world was it the stuff of public controversy? I mean, this is really baffling when you think about it. Does no one have a sense of humor in the United States? Must he say just kidding after every sentence? Should his producers put at the bottom of the screen J/K every time he says something, just so no one will make a mistake? And so this lack of risk is one of the things that makes it so puzzling. That good scarcity, good satire is so scarce. You know, is it fear that keeps satire in a safely confined, or is it simply that so few people today can see the fundamental flaws in the American political system, which trashes liberty in so many ways? So let's talk about Jon Stewart and the host of the Daily Show. Now, he's probably regarded as America's premier political satirist, which I think is kind of ironic given what the story, uh, given the fact that he felt it was necessary to recant after apparently uttering a heresy according to America's civil religion, namely democracy. In an election day interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, after being asked whether he had voted that day, he said no, to which Amanpour reacted with probably feigned amazement. No, she said no. And he continued, I just moved. I don't even know where my thing is now. So that was discussed on CNN as if it was some kind of scandal. And that night on his own show, Stewart felt that he had to reassure the audience about this. So first he cracked a joke about assuring them that the government. I would add the Smothers Brothers, the early Saturday Night Live, Dave Barry, my old friend Dave Barry, The Onion, South Park, Family Guy on some episodes, and so many more. So there's a great tradition of political satire, poking fun, but in a deep way, at the political system in order to ridicule it. Unfortunately, while it would be a slight exaggeration to say that political satire is dead in America, I believe it's been on the critical list for some time. And that's too bad because we really could use it now. Now, throughout history, satirists have risked their liberty and even their lives to use humor to engage in deep commentary about the reigning political system and its exalted political figures, the people who called themselves leaders, but I think are surely better described as rulers and misleaders. But no satirist risks his life or liberty in America today. It's a perfectly safe environment for making fun of the government. I mean, they've droned some American citizens in outside of the country, and they've arrested people, but so far haven't arrested anybody for satire that I can recall recently. It was worse in some respects some years ago. Lenny Bruce was harassed by the police. The excuse they used was his drug use, but I think also he was such a good satirist, making so slashing fun of the political system that I have a feeling that was one of the reasons the police harassed him constantly.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Liberty Me Live. We're here tonight with our monthly Future of Freedom Foundation webinar with Sheldon Richman. This week we'll be talking about the decline of political satire in America and Jon Stewart in particular. Sheldon Richman, if you don't know, is the vice president of the Future of Freedom Foundation and the editor of their monthly journal, Future of Freedom. For 15 years, he was the editor of The Freeman, published by the Foundation for Economic Education. And he's the author of several books, including Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, and Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. He's been widely published everywhere. He's an expert on just about everything, and he's a wonderful teacher. So without further ado, turn it over to him, Sheldon Richman.
I try to be an expert on knowing what I don't know. But thank you for that introduction. Uh, as I usually like to say, being the argumentative person that I am, I think I should take time to rebut the introduction, but since time is scarce, I won't. Well, this is a fun topic, I think. Sad, but at the same time fun. So I hope it'll lead to some a good discussion. Uh, Everybody probably by now is aware of the flap involving Jon Stewart on Election Day. Uh, so I want to talk about that, and I want to draw some other stories into it that have been going on lately. In particular, the Jonathan Gruber story, which I'm sure everybody now knows about. And I'll talk about that a little bit and remind everybody what happened there. It involves the passage of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. But a little background. Let's talk a little bit of background before we get into America's civic religion and Jon Stewart. I want to say a little bit about political satire. Uh, as I think most people know, it has a long and honorable history. Uh, we can name a lot of names. I'm sure I'll leave some important people out. Since my article was published a couple of weeks ago, I've gone back and actually added names because I felt like I slighted people. But obviously, it would be an endless list. But it includes, I mean, you go back to the Greeks, Aristophanes, and then I jumped to Shakespeare and Jonathan Swift and W.S. Gilbert, Mark Twain, George Orwell, Lenny Bruce, Dick Gregory, Tom Lehrer, uh, who, along with David Frost, was responsible for a great series in the 1960s called "That Was the Week That Was." Most of you are probably too young to remember that. George Carlin, of course. There was a British series called Spit and Image in the 80s that ran on American television that involved caricature puppets of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the other political principles of the day. Very good biting satire. Another British series called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. You can find those online, uh, and I advise you to take a look at them. They're hilarious, really well done, making fun of the British